Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 43 with Dr. Lisa Damour, author of Under Pressure. Hello again, OTC listeners. Good to be back with you all and talking today about anxiety with Lisa Damour. Dr. Damour is author of Under Pressure and another book, Untangled, and talking specifically about anxiety and stress for girls and women. And the reason I wanted to speak with her is I found in my own practice, when I first moved away to Virginia, I don't recall anxiety being as big of a thing. It didn't seem like it, at least. And when I actually moved back to Pennsylvania from Virginia and started up group practice with my business partner, one of the things in talking with him we noticed was just, anxiety has just continued to outpace all of the other diagnoses and all of the other issues that people seem to be seeking out mental health services for. And it was this thing where it was just, throughout the country, it's something you heard everybody talking about in the mental health field. And I've had a number of conversations at the personal level with friends and family that they're dealing with anxiety and stress for their school-age children, and especially for girls and women, that seemed to be such a huge thing to tackle that so many people were dealing with. I've had a lot of conversations where friends will come to me and say, they're just, it seems like they're cracking under the weight of all of this pressure with school and social demands and relationships and sports and, just the balance of all of it and the struggle and the push to be perfect and be able to do it all. And it seemed to be having just such a huge effect on them. And for a number of people that I've talked to, even just wanting to opt out of, going to school in person, school refusal, wanting to withdraw and do homeschooling or cyberschooling, and in these instances, I'm mainly speaking to just purely from an anxiety standpoint. I'd never encountered that in years past, and more so in the last 10, 15 years. It's been huge. I've worked with a lot of people that their child just, is like, I'm not doing it. I'm not going. Take me out. I don't want to deal with it. Take me out of school, take me out of this stressful environment. It's too much anxiety. I did a quick search, and so the stats that I'm going to be giving to you in a second here are from NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so that's the NAMI.org. It's just an infographic that they pulled for their You Are Not Alone campaign. And it talks about just the numbers across the country in terms of mental health diagnoses and need. But, 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness, whereas, 1 in 25 U.S. adults experience what they call serious mental illness, so SMI. You'll often hear that term used. And then 17% of youth, 6 to 17 years, experience a mental health disorder. Out of those numbers for the country, in terms of 12-month prevalence of a common mental health illness, and this is pulling from adults, out out of all of them, anxiety far and away leads in terms of 19% of Americans, adults, in a 12-month prevalence deal with some type of anxiety disorder. 19%. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. The others, schizophrenia is at 1%, borderline personality at 1%, bipolar is at 3%. Depression comes in second at 7%, but 19% deal with an anxiety disorder. And why I wanted to speak to Dr. Damour is she is definitely a thought leader in the American Psychological Association in terms of stress and anxiety, especially for girls and women. In her books, she talks about, this could very well, the concepts and the things that she teaches parents could easily be applied to boys and men as well. But it's an area that she was passionate about focusing on. And so a little bit about her. She writes the monthly adolescence column for the New York Times. She's served as a regular contributor to CBS News. She has a private practice. She consults. She speaks internationally. She's a senior advisor to the Schubert Center for Child Studies at Case Western Reserve University, and she serves as the executive director of Laurel School's Center for Research on Girls, which you'll hear her talk about all of those things in her books. But I wanted to put this together so that people would have some resources to go to if they are dealing with it. Again, it's such a prevalent thing, and oftentimes we're kind of behind the eight ball a lot of times. And this was even like pre-COVID-19. Stress and anxiety is sadly nothing new. But a lot of times we don't know we have an issue until stuff starts to tank and, grades start to go down or social life starts to go down or, different things, especially for children. And then we're kind of scrambling to piece together resources and try and figure out what's going on and try to, fix it, so to speak. So as always, thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the episode. So I have on the show today Dr. Lisa Damour, who has written a number of books. One we're focusing on today is Under Pressure. She's been on CBS News, done a number of things, speaking recently on stress and pressure and anxiety, especially for girls and women. And so welcome to the show, Dr. Damour.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm glad we were able to do this. Thank you for helping me navigate the tech side. I was saying, what is it like? I think by our clock, it's like week 11 in quarantine land.
Yeah.
Is that what it is for you all?
I think it may be. I keep thinking I'll go take a look at the calendar and calculate it, and then I don't. And I think part of me just doesn't want to know.
Yeah, exactly. the resistance.
Yep.
Well, yeah, in terms of your work, I was saying, I'd wanted to kind of focus on the stress and the anxiety. Now, a lot of times in your book, you talk about, some of the stats and just some of the knowledge that we have around pressure and anxiety. Can you kind of unpack a little bit of that? What do we know difference in terms of impact for boys, for girls, for men, for women? Yeah.
So, it's long been the case that girls and women get diagnosed with anxiety disorders at a rate of 2 to 1 relative to boys and men. And that's been really established for a very long time. And that piece, we see largely as a function of socialization, where, boys and men are taught by our culture that when they're distressed, they might act out, they, can maybe be hard on the people around them, and that girls and women are taught by our culture that when they're distressed, they will collapse in on themselves, that they sort of, show up with much more in the way of anxiety and depression and things, that are internalizing disorders, as we call them. Um,
Yep.
and so there's a longstanding kind of, cultural reality in terms of a very large disparity in the diagnosis. We've seen in recent years, and there's some early data supporting this trend, that the numbers are going up for anxiety, especially
Hmm.
for young people, and especially for girls. And that's the piece that pushed me to write Under Pressure, was just that, I started practicing, almost 25 years ago now. And when I first practiced, people would talk about stress and anxiety, but it wasn't a constant refrain. And I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, it's just become so much more of the conversation. And I really wanted to try to dig into what was happening and why.
Hmm. Yeah, I can speak to that from my side. Outpatient practice. I had actually moved away to Virginia for a couple of years, and yeah, I probably would have been in that 5 to 10 years ago time frame. And when I moved back to Pennsylvania, it was like, whoa, what happened? Like, when did anxiety just skyrocket so much?
Yeah.
And what are some of the factors that you feel lead to that?
So I was actually really glad to have a whole book to try to sort it out, because I just feel like it's so multifaceted. There's so much happening at once, and the reality is, the book itself, Under Pressure, focuses on the experience for girls, but I would say probably 80% of the book also applies to boys, and plenty of boys and young men really struggle with anxiety.
Hmm.
And so the way I designed Under Pressure is that it's got 6 chapters, and the first one is Girls at Home, and that has to do with how adults react when kids are upset. And I think a lot of those lessons are really powerful for boys and girls. And then one is Girls Among Girls, which has to do with how they manage peer pressure. And then, no, actually, the first chapter is coming to terms with stress and anxiety, which is sort of like the big broad overview. Then Girls at Home, Girls Among Girls, Girls Among Boys, the dynamics that unfold between, the genders, Girls at
Hmm.
School, and then Girls at the Culture. And so I really just tried to um, take this from many, many angles and facets. The big forces I can point to are things, for girls in particular, like, we have asked girls to do so much more these days, that the opportunities for girls are absolutely
Mm.
incredible, that we've never seen
Yeah.
incredible opportunities like these before, and yet we haven't really taken things off their plate. So they're fantastic athletes, and they're learning how to code computers, and they're running the school paper, and they're still expected to be cute, and they're still expected to be nice, and they're still expected to help out more than we might ask other
Hmm.
kids to help out. And so I think there's this sense of just this rising expectation, and with it opportunity, but also, without any relief of kind of traditional girl expectations going alongside that. So that's been a big factor. The
Sure.
other factor that I think is huge is a cultural misunderstanding about stress and anxiety, and a lot more
Mm.
discomfort with it than I think is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and can you speak to that a bit? And I wanted to get into the whole discussion of stress versus anxiety, and I know you talk about that a lot. Of part of it is it's healthy. It's not such a terrible thing. But yeah, I guess let's back up and go with stress versus anxiety and that anxiety continuum concept.
Sure. So, we've always recognized stress and anxiety in psychology as just normal and healthy functions, that can at
Mhm.
times, reach a more concerning level. In terms of how we see them as distinct from one another, um, in the most technical framing, we see stress as a sense of kind of pressure or heavy, expectation or requirement, and anxiety much more in the vein of fear. Um, and and so we do have these technical distinctions that we make. The fact of the matter is, and you know this clinically too, in real life, they just coil around each other. People become
Yeah.
so stressed that then they become anxious about it, or people who have, maybe are in a situation that makes them anxious all the time that will amount to chronic stress. So it's not, they're not so easy to just, tease apart. And you
Yeah.
really, for the most part, don't need to. But there is this thing that's happened, and I'm sure you've watched it happen too, where in the same, I would say in the same time frame where everybody started to be so worried about stress and anxiety, there was this sense that like there was no such thing as a good stress or a good sense of anxiety, that it was always a
Mm.
sign of pathology. It was always grounds for concern.
Yes.
And
The neuroses.
yeah, like it really became problematic. And this can sound a little weirdly conspiracy theory-ish on my part, but I can have this moment of feeling like it almost feels like the wellness industry took us down a path that I wish we hadn't gone down. So I'm all for
Mm.
well-being, but I worry sometimes that the monetization of wellness, this idea that there's a product that can make you feel calm and relaxed, um, may have taken us down a path where people were of the mind that they were supposed to feel calm and relaxed all the time, and any
Mm.
deviation from that was problematic, which is then going to mean if you have normal levels of stress and anxiety, which every human does, now you're going to be stressed about being stressed, and now you're going to be anxious about being anxious, and now you're going to think you
Yeah.
have a clinical problem when you just have a day. And I think
Hmm.
that that's the part that I feel may have gotten out ahead of us and is concerning.
Sure, and I think, I mean, it fits in. I don't know if I would say well, but with just consumerism and like, oh well, there's a product for that, or there's a class for that, or and
Mhm.
it just there's no end in sight. It just keeps going and going and going, and before you know it, we can't wind it back and put it back in the box.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Mm. And in terms of, I know you talk about, yeah, like we were saying, it's stress is a natural part of life. It's actually a good thing, up to a certain point, obviously. And I know in preparing to talk to you, I listened to your interview with Dr. Jonathan Singer,
Mm.
um, American Association of Suicidology, and you referenced, the Holmes-Reyes assessment, that sort of life stress checklist. What is it that you think people don't get about, yeah, anxiety? Just that they don't realize when, okay, this is actually when it's concerning. We've kind of set that bar way too low.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So if we think about the Holmes-Ray scale, which we've moved past in psychology, but the
Mm-hmm.
huge contribution of that is they went about trying to put a number value on life events in terms of how stressful they were, right? And and
Yes.
and so the huge contribution is that very high ranking in that list are things like getting married, having a baby, stuff like that. And that piece of
Yes.
the thinking, and I'll articulate why we've moved beyond it, but that piece of the thinking was a really important development in the understanding of stress, because it really threw into high relief the fact that stress is not inherently negative. Stress is attached to adaptation. And anytime
Mm.
we have to adapt ourselves to a new condition or a new environment, then we find ourselves in a position where we feel stressed. And it can be a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing, but it's stressful if it requires adaptation. So that was the massive step forward that scale helped
Mm-hmm.
us to make. Now, the reason we've since sort of tossed it out as a way of doing, thinking about stress, and this is important, further developments in the field, and the field always develops, and it doesn't mean that what was there was bad. It just means it was not, the
Next
sharpest
iteration.
of what we've got. Um, what we started to realize, and I think this is actually a really fascinating thing about stress, is that stress is incredibly dynamic, and um, and it's dynamic in a couple of important ways. One is it interacts with the current stress of the person who has the new stress. So, for example, under COVID-19 is stressful, but it's not equally stressful for everybody because if your
Mm.
life was pretty good before COVID-19, this is stressful and hard. If your life was really hard before COVID-19, this is layering on top of that. There's the
Yeah.
the cumulative effect of stress. So,
Hmm.
that's really important. And then the other way in which stress is dynamic is that it's modulated by how much support you have. So maybe COVID-19 is really stressful, but you've got fantastic support. That's really different than somebody who finds COVID-19 stressful and also has very little support. So we threw out the idea that you could say, like, this event is this stressful and this event is this stressful
Uh-huh.
because it has to so much be embedded in, well, to whom is it happening under what conditions and what are the available supports? So but all of that, like, I love thinking in those much more nuanced and sophisticated ways about stress because it gets us past the part of the conversation we're stuck in, which is, or where I worry the culture is stuck, which is stress is bad, make stress stop. And
Hmm.
that's not productive or useful. The question about, well, when does it become bad, right? When do stress and anxiety go from being normal and healthy features of human life to pathological? So for
Hmm.
stress, what we always say is, stress is expectable under conditions that require change. It's actually growth giving. You stretch yourself. You gain capacity when you are stressed. But we don't want it to cross two lines. We don't want it to turn into chronic stress, where people get no break at all from persistent stress. And we don't want it to turn into trauma. We don't want an
Mm.
overwhelmingly horrible event. But take those two things off the table, the rest is normal stress. And
Hmm.
then for anxiety, what we say is, okay, anxiety is really effective and normal and healthy if it is effectively corresponding to a real threat. So if I'm driving and someone cuts me off and I have an anxiety response, that's good. That's normal,
Hmm.
healthy, protective, and useful. We don't like anxiety only under two conditions. One is when it happens and nothing's wrong, that there's anxiety, but there's no corresponding threat. So that
Yeah.
that we
Misfires.
want to, exactly, like, just the alarm is ringing and there's no reason for it. The other is if the anxiety is grossly out of proportion to the threat. So,
Mm.
like right now under COVID-19, I don't love going to the grocery store anymore. Like, I find it a pretty anxiety provoking
You don't
situation.
say.
Yeah. But if I have a panic attack at the grocery store, that's actually not healthy and useful for me. But
Hmm.
the heightened arousal and the awareness that comes with the anxiety when I'm at the grocery store is probably helpful for me. Um, but a panic attack would be too much.
Sure. And I think that's where, as parents, we get into uh, murky waters, I guess I would say, because I think so often well, you're okay. Why are you anxious about this? Don't, it's kind of like when they're like, oh, well, just think happy thoughts, don't think
Mhm.
about it,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
obviously works so well.
Exactly. Exactly.
And can you talk a bit about that anxiety as capacity building? I loved the analogies for the weightlifting and the swimming pool from your previous book. Can you kind of talk about both of those a little bit?
Sure. So, the to go with the weightlifting analogy, which is in under pressure, that is actually how I talk with kids about the growth giving benefits of stress. So, what I say to them is, look, stress is like lifting weights. And I'm very on the nose about it. I say, look, school is supposed to be stressful in the way that a weightlifting program is supposed to be stressful, which is that it progressively asks you to up your your output as you get
Hmm.
stronger. And so, I'll say to them, like, look, you come in, we give you the eighth grade weights. They feel heavy at the start of the year. You work out on them over the year. We give you heavier weights as the year goes on. Every time you gain strength and become really familiar with the material, we take that away and we give you new, harder, heavier material. Like, that's how school works. And
Hmm.
so it's really useful because then it can go two directions from there that are very helpful to students. One direction is to say, so given that, you don't need to be stressed about being stressed. In fact, when you find the work hard, when you feel somewhat overwhelmed by it, not drowning, but feeling like it's a heavy lift, you should actually be encouraged that you're getting what you came for. In the same way that when people are lifting weights, it's not actually all that physically pleasant to work really hard in the weight room, but people don't mind it because they sort of feel like, yeah, but that's where the payoff happens. And we have
Hmm.
really nice research. Aaliyah Crum does this research out of Stanford showing that it really changes people's experience of stress if they are in the moment of stress able to honor its growth-giving qualities. Um, the other thing it helps us do is to focus instead on recovery, and that the stress is not the problem. It's the need for recovery where a lot of students
Mm.
get themselves into trouble. And by into trouble, meaning are so overloaded with work, have so many APs, have such high expectations around them that it's not that they can't do the work, it's that they can't do the work and also have time to recover and restore themselves. And so the goal is to really help students appreciate that they need to recover. They can't maintain the levels that they want to if they don't recover, but they don't need to be so frightened about the stress and recover in the same way that weightlifters recover from hard workouts.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, and I usually put it in the framework of off of the weightlifting of you think of like the Olympic lifting where it's like massive amounts, where they're doing a deadlift or something like that, and they're not just holding it forever. They
yeah,
snap it up, they hit the stance that they need to, and then they let it go,
exactly,
and
exactly.
just the negative impact that can happen from that no recovery, like you were saying.
Yeah. You also asked
And
about the
in
swimming pool metaphor,
yes, yes,
which because I love metaphors, I find them incredibly
yes.
helpful.
I
Um,
yeah, that's I do a lot of my work through that as well. So yeah, thank you.
yeah, no, they go so far. Um, so that's in Untangled, which is the book I published in 2016, which is just about, it's about normal and healthy development in teenagers. Um, and it's about how teenagers start to gain independence from their parents or start to accomplish more sort of psychological distance from their parents. And I came up with a metaphor because it's not the case that teenagers gradually come a little bit more independent. They don't sort of move away inch by inch, but they actually come back and forth to parents.
Mm.
And so the metaphor, and it's a little bit kind of long and clunky, and I would have thrown it away, except for I've had enough families come back to me and be like, that was the one that got
That
us through. That I'm like,
hey,
okay,
if
I'll
it
keep it.
works.
It works. So the metaphor, and this applies both for boys and girls very much, is that the teenager's the swimmer, the water's the world, and the pool is the parent that holds the whole thing together. And where teenagers really want to be is out in the water. They want to be out swimming around with their friends. They want to be playing and, like working out. Um, and when they're doing that, they don't even think about the pool. Like they're not thinking about the concrete that holds it all together. They're just, in
Hmm.
their world. And that's in family life. That's like when your kid hasn't talked to you for days. Like you have no idea what's going on. You haven't seen them. You don't know what's up with them. And then out in the water, something happens. They maybe become exhausted or overwhelmed, or somebody dunks them, or something like that. And they suddenly feel like they're drowning and they come scrambling for the edge of the pool. And this is the parent. So
Hmm.
in family life, this is where your kid is suddenly talking to you and maybe upset and maybe taking comfort and being really close and being really loving. And often for parents, they're like, yay, I've missed you so much. This is great. Even though the kid's upset. And then what
Yeah.
happens is they get their breath back and they start to feel better. And um, and then for the kid, they feel like, oh my gosh, like I feel like a baby. I'm clinging to the edge of the pool. This is so awkward. And so they shove off. They very abruptly depart from the parent, and often it's by like saying something kind of like a little bit mean or a little bit rude,
Yeah.
or just sort of like walking away silently. And and the parents like, what just happened? Like we were having this like great moment, and the kid is just like, okay, I got my breath back, and like this is now like this feels way too regressive, so like I'm not even
Bye.
talking anymore. So I offer this metaphor not because there's like some secret hack that can make you prevent it, but more so that parents understand what this dynamic is and really can savor the closeness with their kid and not take it that personally when the teenager feels like, all right, this now feels babyish, I gotta go.
Yeah, that idea of a lot of it is helping parents to understand. I imagine a large portion of your work is with the parents, trying to, yes, this is normal. Like, okay, this is how we should handle this, or, and that it made me think of, if you were the swimmer and the pool wasn't a pool, it was like jagged rocks where like it
Yeah.
wasn't quite safe to swim to the edge, or you never knew what you were going to get. You could think of the impact that would have on a teen or a child.
Absolutely, right? I mean, where kids really do need a safe place to harbor when they feel overwhelmed, and they often can pull themselves together pretty quickly. Um, but it is scary. And what you hope in those situations is that they've got some other good grown up in their life that they can lean on.
Mm.
And certainly those swimming pool interactions happen in school settings. I consult 2 days a week to a girls' school in my community, and I'll sometimes have had it happen where maybe a student I don't even know that well sees me in the hall on a day when she's upset, and she's like, Dr. Damour, and like comes in my office, completely falls apart. I feel like I get to know her. I'm really glad to have been helpful. I suddenly feel really connected to the student. And then the next time I'm walking by her in the hall, like I notice she like doesn't even catch my eye. And I started to realize I'm like, "Oh, she's still feeling a little weird about how, exposed she was when we were together."
Mm.
And then usually a couple weeks later, I'll see her in the hall, she'll be like, "Hey, Dr. Damour," like but there's something about needing to accomplish that distance actually after that intense regressive closeness that I've watched teenagers play out in other settings. And so you hope at home that kids have a safe place to go, but if not, luckily there's so many good grown-ups often in a kid's environment and kids know who they can
Mm.
trust, and I think that's something that can fill in a little bit.
But I always love I forget the whole quote because it's actually quite long kind of monologue of like just the restorative power of one positive force in a
Yes.
kid's life. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. No, 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 that consistent finding that kids like, we see these kids who've just been through the absolute wars in their childhood, and yet they somehow seem to be intact, and when we ask them what the story is, that there was one grown up who had just this, deep devotion to them, and that was enough.
Hmm. And yeah, I think when you see some of those, you know, professional athletes or musicians or celebrities of like who was that one person, they usually have that like a teacher or an uncle or somebody that was that for them.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and
So
I
here's to
imagine
good
you get a
grown-ups.
lot of. Sorry, what did you say?
Here's to the good grown-ups who take care of teenagers.
Yes, yeah. Well, and I always say as a therapist, I mean, we need those success stories. We need to hear some of those a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have to answer that question a lot of like, is my kid going to be okay? Like, is this, are we able to fix this?
It's interesting, what you said about helping parents and helping parents understand, what's going on. I would say that is probably, um, most of my work, right, is around
Yeah.
translating adolescence for parents. And my book under Untangled, is just really much it's such a book about normal development because I couldn't find the book I wanted that explained to parents how much of normal development is kind of chaotic and hairy. And and so the way I built that book is it's got these 7 developmental transitions from childhood to adulthood, and it's the chapter titles. So it's parting with childhood, joining a new tribe, harnessing emotions, contending with adult authority, planning for the future, entering the romantic world, and caring for oneself. And so in every chapter, I talk through, here's what your daughter's doing that is strange and weird, but here's why she's doing it, and here's how it's helping her move forward on this developmental, trajectory. And then every chapter ends with a when to worry section. And that
Mm.
was the way
Yeah.
like, when I came up with that solution when writing, I was like, "Oh, okay, this is really helpful," because so much of normal development looks strange. The parents are like, "Should I be worried now?" And so,
Yeah.
it was very helpful, like, developmental trajectory by developmental trajectory to say, "Okay, now you should worry." Like, if your kid doesn't have friends or if your kid only ever gets in conflicts, now you got a problem on your hands. If they have garden variety
Yeah.
conflicts, like, that's normal development.
Sure.
And that to me is, I think, so much of what parents are looking for.
Yeah. I was, so thrilled to find your books and thank you so much for the work that you've done and the work that you're continuing to do. Because I think so many of us. I'm down at the kiddie pool end right now. Like I have a 7-year-old.
Oh,
So we're not into those waters yet, and we have a boy and a girl. So
uh-huh.
I'm going to be dealing with both sides of it, and yeah, I think a lot of times it's our own anxiety as parents off of our own stuff, our own childhood or our own relationships, and I think it's natural to want to protect our kids and for them to have better than we had or have it easier than we had. But obviously not a good thing to like put them in a bubble and protect them from every little thing.
No, and in fact, it's such an interesting thing under COVID-19 where everybody's distress is so universal and, what's going on, at some level we can protect kids, hopefully, if we have the kind of privilege that allows us to from, worries about contamination or exposure or things like that. But, the level of disruption we're all dealing with, pervades life. And
Mm.
so it's been a really interesting time to be working in the parenting space because parents
Yeah.
have to help kids through this, and they also have to not be scared. And they have to have confidence they can help their kids through this. And they also have to not worry that their kids are going to be damaged by going through a hard time. And that's something
Mm.
that has been much more of a subtext than I realized, that parents worry, and this is a terrible fear to have to live with. They worry that if their kid is going to be distressed, that it will somehow harm their child to feel that intense distress. And that is something I find myself sort of working double overtime to reassure parents. No, no, no. Like, we're all built to withstand psychological distress, children and adults alike. You don't have to be worried that your kid is upset. Like, they probably should be right now. That's the right reaction. That's
Mhm.
developmentally appropriate.
Well, I loved one of your responses in some of the interviews of, almost having to temper your reaction of like, yeah, good. Like, that's great that you experienced that. That means it's working. Like your body and your brain are working. And, kind of, again, having to help parents understand that, like, okay, when to worry, when is that point? You're listening to OTC episode 43 with Dr. Lisa Damour, author of Under Pressure. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
Are there ways that you have found to help parents balance that? I sort of think of it as the balance between, are you okay? Like asking your kid, are you okay? And telling your kid, you're okay. Just suck it up.
That's interesting. Because I think there is a balance to be had there.
Hmm.
That that I think it's funny. The first piece I wrote for the New York Times at this point, like I think 7 or 8 years ago, was about the hazards of being a psychologist and a parent. And 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 the way
Sorry,
I
do you have the URL for that?
Yes, you can find it on my website. It's right there.
I'm gonna need
Yeah, no, we
that.
all do, and it's funny. The story I tell in the article is I was, extremely pregnant, like kind of end of term, end of pregnancy pregnant with my older daughter when my oldest daughter when uh I was sitting in a supervision meeting with a senior colleague. I had been licensed for a few years, but I was still purchasing supervision. And she's a good friend. And she said to me, she's like, so, do you want to hear how psychologists mess up their kids? And I was like, yes, yes, because in my practice, some of the most hamstring kids I care for are the kids of clinicians. And she said,
Uh-huh.
they talk to them about their feelings too much. So
Hmm.
when their child's upset, they're standing there saying, or having a tantrum, they're standing there saying, oh, you're having a big mad feeling. Something's made you very upset. What do you think the deal is? When actually what the kid needs is for the parent to be like, cut it out. Like, just get yourself together. And she was dead right. Her name is Debbie Paris. She's someone I adore. And the good news is, first of all, my husband's not a psychologist, and so he's very good at the cut it out and just pull yourself together. And also, I was raised by someone who was in the more kind of cut it out, get yourself together department. So I knew I had models to fall back on, and
Mhm.
and so I think psychologists can just tip too far in the let's talk about your feelings, let's talk about feelings all the time. But I think the goal for parents is to listen to cues for when kids do want to talk and pick up those cues. So a lot of it is the
Mm.
kid initiating the wish to talk about feelings as opposed to the parent driving that train. Parents paying attention if something seems really wrong, where the kid is not verbalizing distress, but not sleeping or not, complaining of tummy aches all the time or something like that. But then the rest of the time, there is a lot to be said for um, really, kind of pulling oneself together and leaning into one's strengths and parents holding kids to that expectation. I have a sort of a funny story. I had been speaking at a school in Columbus, Ohio, a couple hours away from where I live. And the head of school was this terrific guy, this very tall guy. And I had to get something out of my car. So he came out to my car, and I have this wonderful 2012 RAV4 that I love. I'm like, this is my dream car. I love my car. It gets me everywhere. I don't care if anybody dings it. It's perfect. And he said, "Oh, he said, my dream car was a Fiat Mini, and and all my life I'd
Something
wanted
he
one. And
wouldn't
I
fit
finally,
into.
well, exactly." And he said, "And I finally, my kids got old enough." And he said, "I went down to the dealer. I picked out my Fiat Mini, and and I had my wife come look at it before I bought it." And he said, I was standing next to it, and she looked at the Mini and looked at me, and she said, "Honey, you are a grown ass man. You cannot have that car." And I thought this was such a funny story. So I come back from
Yeah.
Columbus and I tell my two daughters about this, and my daughters are 9 and 16, and I tell them because I just thought it was a really funny story. And then about a couple weeks later, I had to drive myself down to a hospital in central Cleveland in this extremely complex. I was giving grand rounds to the pediatrics group, but it was in this extremely complex neighborhood and hard to get to. And I have a horrible sense of direction. I mean, like deeply impaired. And so I was like, I get all anxious about this. I was like, oh, you guys, I really don't want to drive down there. Like, I don't know where I'm going and I'm not sure how to park there. And it just makes me really nervous. And like, maybe I'll take an Uber and maybe, gosh, I'm like, this is the fantasies of when I would have a driver and I wish I had a
Oh, you got hit with your own.
my 9-year-old. She's like, Mom,
Oh,
you are
9-year-old,
a grown
nice.
ass woman. Get yourself down there. And it was so funny and it was so perfect. This kind
Did
of
she
like,
just like mic drop and walk away?
yeah,
Just
basically, just like pull yourself together. So it's actually now this running joke in our family, and it works really well. Where if somebody's upset, like for a while, they get empathy.
Hmm.
And then after a while, you can, and part of why it works is because it's funny. Then you can say, okay, you're a grown ass woman. Like, what are you going to
Yeah.
do? And
Yeah.
I actually think there's real value in having a funny, lighthearted way to um, shift into that gear of saying, okay,
Mm.
get yourself put together and go out and deal with this.
Well, I think my youngest is 3, and I did this with my 7-year-old also, kind of off of that. Of when you think of they bite it biking. At first you're like freaked out and you're like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like, let me check all your parts. Like, you got all your teeth. And then once you have that, you give them like the, are you okay? You give them a hug, and then it's like, okay, we're good.
Yep.
Like, dust off, you'll be okay. And so it's kind of that balance of the checking in and the, hey, are you okay? And then, okay, we're good.
Absolutely. And this is something so interesting I find in clinical work with teenagers, where there's that very delicate line of making sure they've got everything they need. So maybe a teenager who, is saying things that are worrisome, to adults, like, I really just wish I weren't here, or I'm not sure what to do with myself, or, those things that get into those zones that make us very anxious as clinicians. And I think that's like some of my like most fascinating clinical work is that you're both putting in place everything that teenager may need. Like, okay, well, if you're feeling really sad, who can you let know? And are you sure you're, safe to be good with yourself and all of that? Like, can you keep yourself safe? Doing all of that while at the same time communicating a general sense that you think the teenager will be just fine and that you're there and have confidence in that. So not minimizing the distress they have and not ignoring the, kind of vague smoke signals that are being sent, but not dragging that kid down to the ER and getting them evaluated, for whether or not they should be admitted for suicidality, like a very strong
Hmm.
overreaction, which in my experience can terrify kids. So I
Yeah.
think it's this interesting, line of both in some ways being all over it, like, are you sure you're safe? And then who would you tell if you weren't safe? And all of those things side by side with, I'm so glad we're talking. I think you're going to get yourself through this just fine. Like a confidence that the child and or the teenager really is going to be okay. Because I think they need that from us. It's very scary when they see us overreacting.
Sure, and the example from early childhood, and I think you touched on this in the very beginning of the book. Of when a kid hurts themselves, what do? They look at us first,
Yep. Yep.
and
They
then they
scrape their
react.
knee. They are
Yeah.
like, okay, how bad is it? I'm going to check your face, and that's what's going to tell me.
Yes. I look, yeah, and then they look to the parent or the adult, the caregiver, for like, hey, is this okay? Like, how are you reacting to this?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and I think, yeah, sometimes having that poker face a little bit as a parent.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or just to be able to say, like, with our words, like, you're okay, come over here, I'll get you cleaned up. I saw you scraped your knee. So we're all over it. We're not saying you're fine, but with our tone in our face, making it clear, I'm not frightened. This is contained. You don't need to be scared.
And one thing I'd want to, I guess I'll kind of start at the micro level as like, please give me parenting advice right now. This is really why I set up the podcast interview with you. I just wanted to. But yeah, in the book you talk a bit about concepts in exposure response prevention, and that it's not always the best thing to like, oh, you're scared of this test, well, let's pull you out of school and you won't have to take any tests. And so yeah, some of that helping them navigate it as opposed to just removing the whatever the trigger is that.
Oh, hugely important. So this is something that I almost feel like I wish I had airplanes and I could fly them over cities with banners, because my banner would say avoidance feeds anxiety. And this is something we have established so clearly in academic psychology, or on the research side, and it's something that we've done such a terrible job of communicating to the general culture or the general population. So it has really become commonplace. And I can't overstate how drastically problematic I consider this to be. But it has really become commonplace that if something makes a kid anxious, a teacher, a test, a circumstance at school, an after school expectation, that because parents have come to believe that anxiety is bad, it's become very typical for parents to think maybe the best solution is to remove the child from the situation, that makes them anxious. And um, everyone in academic psychology be like, no, don't do that. And the reason being is that the anxiety will then grow. The problem, of course, is that in the immediate short term, the anxiety goes way down. And that's actually part of the trick in this that needs to be recognized, which is that when avoidance feeds anxiety, it's a two-course meal. So say, for example, you have a kiddo who's scared about elevators, and you're like, no, 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 we're going to take the elevator today. And they're like, oh, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And you can see their anxiety rising. And so you say, okay, fine, we'll take the stairs. And they're like, ah, so immediate
Hmm.
reinforcement, immediate
Yeah.
relief. So okay. So the avoidance just got reinforced. So you're now going to have more avoidance going forward. And then the other thing that happens is the kid never gets on an elevator and discovers that they really, like 99.999% of the time, work just fine. And so they don't have any competing experience. And so then the next time that you're like, okay, now we're going to try the elevator, they're going to be like, no, the avoidance feels awesome, right? And so it just
It worked.
amplifies the situation. So of course, so you mentioned exposure and response prevention. So this is, of course, how we cure phobias, not just treat phobias or help mitigate them. We cure phobias, and the way phobias develop is actually avoidance. So what we always need to do is whatever it is that a child fears that is in the range of things they should and should reasonably be expected to deal with, we can't let them avoid, but we actually have to help them take small steps toward it. So maybe it's, okay, let's do this. Let's get on the elevator, hold hands, breathe deeply for a few minutes to keep your anxiety under control. And we get off. We don't even have to let the doors closed, and like gradually working one's way up to being able to tolerate normal engagement with something like an elevator or a test or a teacher or an after school activity. But the minute avoidance comes into it, you are in trouble.
Well, and I imagine you see this a lot with your work with the school, in terms of school refusal, school avoidance, switching to online schooling, things like that.
It's been
Yeah.
interesting. I was speaking online at a school and taking questions from parents, and a parent said, "My daughter has generalized anxiety disorder, and she's actually loving online school. Should I find her
Hmm.
an online school for when things go back to normal?" And I was like, "No, absolutely not. Like, I can
Yeah.
expand, but the basic answer to that question is absolutely not. That is feeding the avoidance that is actually something that can be treated and taken care of."
Well, and that's some of where I was headed is, what do you see? What are you predicting as some of the fallout of COVID-19? Because in my work with teens, you've got the set that they're like, hey,
Yeah.
this is actually better. There's no stress, and then you've got the others that were really more extroverted, socially connected, and they're really struggling because all that's been cut off. I'm anticipating on the other side of this, the reverse problem of, okay, well, what happens when, things open up to go back to school, and a lot of kids are going to be like, I don't want to go back. Like, this was great.
I am too. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think, most kids are going to be like, yay, like, let's
Yeah,
live our lives. They're already trying to now.
yeah.
Um, but I think both for kids and adults, there's going to be some resistance to going back to life as it was before. This has been very frightening, and in many ways, what we've had is state mandated avoidance, and this time for good
Mhm.
reason. But I think for everybody who feels scared, they may have to go out bit by bit, and just take it in steps. And I think for kids who are struggling, we really may need to structure a way that they gradually reengage. But letting them continue in this avoidant pattern is actually going to make it very hard for them to engage the world at all, in an going way. So it's not something we have any option about. They need to move in slowly, and it really may be they go to school for a part of a day, or they go to a class that they feel comfortable going to, and they the next day they go to two classes. So we don't usually expect kids to just take it on whole if they're really, really frightened, but we do need them to move towards whatever it is they fear.
And yeah, in a client situation, typically off of exposure response prevention, I'm doing the hierarchy of distress and subjective units of distress type of stuff where you're listing out, okay, what are the things that produce the stress, what are the triggers, and then trying to sort of incrementally set up trials, like you said, of like, okay, well, let's do one class today, and
Yep.
tomorrow we'll try two, and just sort of slowly turning up the heat a little bit.
Yeah, and the thing that I think, again, I blame psychology. I feel like we've not shown the world what we know. Um, we don't ask people, you know this, but I think for your audience, we don't ask people to just like tough it out. Like we give them really effective strategies for getting their
Mhm.
anxiety under control. The breathing works, and it works at the neurological level, and muscle relaxation works. So we teach people strategies that do in fact drive down their physiological anxiety before we put them in situations that they know may raise that anxiety. And we don't just like throw them in without any swimming lessons, that we really we give them swimming lessons, we start them in the shallows, and then we move them up. And I think sometimes people assume that we're just asking people to white knuckle it, and we're not. We really have, lots of skills to teach, and then, we move people into deeper and deeper waters as they become more adept at the skills. And I wish people knew more how cautious and systematic we are in psychology when we're helping people manage avoidance.
Sure. Yeah, and a lot of the groundwork of I know you've talked before, and we talk about this so much of coping skills and relaxation techniques, and that blend of mindfulness and things like that to help the person with, okay, well, so what are you feeling? Describe it to me, and what level would you put it at? Is it a 10? Is it a 1? Is it and
Mhm.
and then again, some of the, okay, so it's at an 8. How terrible is an 8? Can you sit with that for a while? I don't know. For me, I've been saying I'm anticipating on the other side of this a large increase in obsessive compulsive symptoms and diagnosis.
I think that may be true. And it's interesting because if we think about it, it's the same model, which is if I have the worry that I touched something that's contaminated, my anxiety goes up. When I wash my hands, my anxiety goes down, and so the hand washing gets reinforced. And I think the more we can do as clinicians to help people understand anxiety and processes that reinforce the anxiety, the more we may be able to cut some of that off at the pass.
Sure. And I also anticipate on a positive end some of what you were talking about earlier of, well, having we can do the AP courses, just not in the time that's allotted. I'm anticipating a number of families really reevaluating on the other side of this. Like, do we really need to be doing, travel soccer and, choir and this and that? Like I think you're going to see some paring down, I think.
I hope so. I mean, it's interesting, when I talk to high schoolers, which I do a lot, I'm like, you guys, if I look at the junior year, it's not that you can't do the work, but what if we spread it over 2 years? That would
Mhm.
be an incredible thing. I mean, they would learn, obviously I don't have that kind of power, but I think sometimes there is this confusion, like when a kid's feeling overwhelmed, the idea that somehow the work is too hard. No, no, no. Like they can totally do the work. They can't do the work in the time allotted, And so
Yeah.
if we play with the time idea, this looks really different.
And Yeah, I mean, we're kind of answering that question. So yeah, zooming out to that macro level, if you had the airplanes and the megaphones, and you were, I don't know, president of mental health for the country, yeah, what are
Don't give me this kind of powers.
they'll just give you that runway. Just run with it. I want to, yeah. What would you try to make a change in?
I would change. I would try to restore an accurate definition of mental health. So what I mean by that is I really worry, and I'm not someone who gets worried very easily. I really worry that the prevailing definition of mental health has become that you feel good, and that's how you know somebody's mentally healthy. And the actual definition of mental health needs to be that you have the right feeling at the right time and you have the capacity to manage that feeling effectively. So, if things are sad, you should feel sad. If it's frightening, you should feel scared. If it's, um, if there's grounds for concern, you should feel concerned. These will all be unpleasant and uncomfortable, and they're actually powerfully useful feelings, and they need to be felt. Um, the only time we are in trouble is if the person lacks the capacity to manage their distress in ways that are adaptive. And so, I mean, that would be the thing that I would press on is this idea that um, feelings are information. They are hugely necessary for us to make decisions in our lives. And we only worry when a person cannot manage feelings in ways that are healthy.
Wow. Yeah, that's. Can you say that again? Sorry, I feel like that's just.
Time with feeling.
Yes. Well, not with feeling. I mean, there was plenty of feeling, but I feel like that's just so important for people to hear again.
Mental health that we need, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So, where to from here? What do you have in the fire? What kind of irons you got? What kind of projects you working on? Yeah.
In terms of what I'm working on now, it's funny. I'm not. I Untangled or Under Pressure has been out for about 15 months. I've been out speaking about it a lot, and obviously my travel is really gone, which is okay. I'm doing a lot online and enjoying that a lot.
You sound devastated.
Yeah, no, it's actually, I'm sort of like, I was a little flipped out, but now I'm like, okay, like this is what we're doing now. I guess I'll adjust.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like, oh, what should I turn to next? And what I think I'm turning to next is managing under COVID-19. That's where all
Yeah.
my work has been centered. Everything I've done for the Times lately has been entirely around parenting under COVID-19 conditions. This is, such a bomb to have dropped in the middle of development and the middle of family life, and it pervades every aspect of a young person's life. And I think we'll get through it. I think we can get kids through it. I think there's an enormous amount parents can do to get kids through this. But suddenly, this seems to be the work, and I'm really glad and honored to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely have links to your page in the show notes. But I loved, you collaborated with UNICEF. I mean, you're putting a lot of things out, obviously, on parenting in COVID-19 and how to help kids, and just the importance of those, a little bit of structure, a little bit of routine, and it doesn't have to be rigid, but we need that, we crave that. But then also for yourself of like, we don't have to be running a marathon. We don't have to be writing 10 books. We got enough going on.
Yeah, I think I do worry about that a little bit, this sense of like, can you use this time to cure cancer? No, your job is to get through this. And I think, by
We're
way
in
of,
survival.
yeah, we're in survival mode. And by way of like kind of thinking about like, how to sort of put a bow on it. And as we think about all that we've talked about and then the context of COVID-19, so if the first part of the definition of mental health is that you have the right feeling at the right time, and then the second part is that you have the capacity to manage it effectively, the thing I am absolutely preoccupied with at this point is how people are coping, and really trying to clarify for people that there's negative coping and there's positive coping. And,
Mhm.
negative coping is coping insofar as it does help people feel better, but it's negative insofar as it will actually not work well over the long haul. So things like, cutting people off emotionally, emotional withdrawal, or using substances, or not taking good care of oneself, taking the phone to bed and just scrolling and scrolling instead of sleeping, or, only eating comfort foods, or being really cranky with people as a way to manage distress. That I worry that if people go down that road, by the time we get to the end of this, they're going to be in really rough shape. And then the flip being, positive coping strategies, which are just the opposite of those things. So, like finding the right, good, healthy social connections, and using happy distractions instead of substances when we need to take a break from things, so like losing yourself in a TV show or a book, or, going outside, taking really good care of ourselves, like probably better than ever. Um, and then, of course, taking good care of other people. It's good for them. It's good for us. It all works well in the long haul. And I think for me, when I think about like this big, massive COVID-19 and the big mental health questions that are all coming up, I think so much of what we need to say is it's going to be about coping and coping and coping. And if you go down the negative road, you're going to wish you hadn't. And if you go down the positive road, you'll probably be okay.
Mhm. Well, and again, on that concept of the continuum of, we will come out on the other side of this. We will be, okay, in some fashion. Everybody will take their hits in whatever way, the stress or this pandemic has affected them. But, thinking back to Spanish flu, like we obviously made it through that. So again, we'll come out the other side, and just being ready to move from survival into some of the other phases.
Yeah.
Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your time and being willing to be on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all of your work. I do have to throw in, I loved one that you narrated your own audiobook. I always love that. I feel like it connects the listener to the author even more. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. I love doing it.
Yeah. And I selfishly, again, I would like to have you back on off of listening to your conversation with Dr. Singer in terms of dating and sex and rape culture. And I hope to not enter into the dating pool for a couple of years now, but yeah, we'll see.
Well, I would be happy to have that conversation. There's so much we can do to get this right for kids that we're not doing right now.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Take care.
You too. And there you have it. Another episode done and in the books. Thank you all for checking out the show. And if you want to find out more about Dr. Lisa Damour, you can see her website. It's Dr. Lisa Damour. Last name is Damour. So that's drlisadamour.com. She's got a lot of resources on there, access to the books. You can invite her for a speaking engagement if you're interested, or check out where she's going to be speaking if you want to hear her. But I definitely recommend checking out the column that she writes and the other interviews that she's been a part of. So again, hope it helps. I'll see you all next episode. In OTC episode 44, I'll be speaking with Sharday Washington, who is an LMFT in the Richmond, Virginia area. Going to be bringing an episode about racial trauma, racial injustice, and what we can do to change some of that, and what you can do if you're experiencing some of that. Take care. Catch you all next episode. Well, if you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're catching this podcast. You can check out detailed show notes and any other resources given in the show at www.pfsonthecouch.com. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming episodes, guests, or contribute questions to the show, be sure to follow along on any of your favorite social media platforms. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. A special thanks to the band The Topsy-Turvies for the show theme song. Their song, Like a Living Dead, can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The bump interview track was the song 1973 by Bruno E. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to show editor Casey Lehman and show producer Trevor Groff.